gathering here for this special session. And our primary motive is to address a period of crisis in our own lives that's not widely recognized. There's been much alarm, and yet the half of it has not been told. One of the things we're going to deal with tonight is there are now two plagues that are incurable, that result in certain death, that involve genetic defects for which there's no vaccine available, that are the subject of deliberate lies and deceit by the government, by our schools, and by the media. Not surprisingly, the Bible has anticipated them both. But before we get into this, I'd like to get into some basic background. It's interesting, if you'll turn to Acts chapter 7. Let's just start with Acts chapter 7. Chapter 7 of the book of Acts is one of these unusual chapters in the Bible. Chapter 7 in the book of Acts is in the New Testament, but it's the occasion where Stephen defends himself, so to speak, before the Sanhedrin, the most august Jewish body at that time. And in Acts chapter 7, we learn many things. In his review of the Old Testament, we learn many things about the Old Testament that are not in the Old Testament. It's an interesting passage for that reason, well known for that reason. Somebody says, I sure like a good commentary in the Old Testament. Say, how about Acts 7? But the verse I'd like to highlight is verse 22, because it summarizes something that in and of itself may not surprise you. You all probably have seen this famous Cecil B. DeMille movie, The Ten Commandments. And one of DeMille's trademarks was extensive research. And you may recall that that movie was based on a lot of ancient records in addition to the Bible. And of course portrays much of this, so it won't be a surprise to you. But in verse 22 it says, speaking of Moses, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. I wanted to start there because on the one hand, most of us recognize that Moses was trained. In fact, he was brought up in the court of Pharaoh. So he was trained with the best expertise available at that time. He was learned. It says here, I'm using the scriptures, the authority for this, without having to get into Josephus and the other things. Moses was learning all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Not most, all. Well, let's find out what some of that wisdom involved. He was tutored by the best medical experts of that day. What was the medical perspective of that day? We have a record. There is a document known as the Papyrus Ebers. It's a medical book that was written in Egypt about 1332 BC. And it's representative of the medical views of that day. And I thought it would be interesting, just to start, to take advantage of some of these medical insights. Are there any among us that are losing their hair? Don't give me your hands, just think about it. Let me tell you what Papyrus Ebers, the days of Moses, would counsel you. When it falls out, and I'm not quoting, one remedy is to apply a mixture of 6 fats, namely those of the horse, the hippopotamus, the crocodile, the cat, the snake, and the ibex. To strengthen it, anoint with the tooth of a donkey crushed in honey. Have any of you tried that? Okay. It works like it. Right. Let's see what Mary Kay can do with that one. Right, yeah. There was a special dressing prescribed for Queen Sheshek. Equal parts of a heel of an Abyssinian greyhound, date blossoms, ass's hooves, boiled in oil. Anyone try that one?
Not yet.
Is your hair turning gray? We have a recipe for you. To prevent hair from turning gray, according to the ancient arts of the Egyptians, you anoint it with the blood of a black calf, which has been boiled in oil, or with the fat of a rattlesnake. Anyone try that? Okay. This one, has any one of you been bitten by a poisonous snake? You are to give them magic water to drink. That's water poured over a special idol. That was their viewpoint. Now this one will really impress you. If you have an embedded splinter, you are to apply worm's blood mixed with ass's dung. Now that's what you and I would call, I see the doctors in the audience, that's what we would call today a tetanus kit. Now if you're going to outfit the proper medicine cabinet for that day, apparently these are the things that you need to include, because there are other elements of various remedies. Lizard's blood, and I'm being exhaustive, I've just selected the more colorful ones. Swine's teeth, putrid meat, stinking fat, moisture from pig's ears, milk goose grease, ass's hooves, we've mentioned that, animal fats from various sources, and excreta. Did I say that politely? This is after a family tape. They're more common terms, I think. Excreta from animals, including human beings, donkeys, antelopes, dogs, cats, and even flies. I can't resist this. I'm sorry, Nan, but it sounds like a bunch of crap to me. My wife will take me to task about that later. Now, you're probably wondering, what's that got to do with anything? Here's the interesting insight. I've just picked a colorful sampling of the wisdom of the court of Pharaoh of that day that Moses had been taught. What's fascinating about the Bible isn't just what's in it. What's fascinating about the Bible is what's not in it. You cannot find any trace of any of this nonsense in the writings of Moses. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, obviously have none of this in it. It would obviously be quickly discredited. And yet what's on the other side of the coin, what it does do is highlight insights that have not appeared on the medical horizon until recent years. And I thought it would be interesting to look at that. But specifically, you might turn with me to Exodus chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15. Go to Genesis, turn to the right. And we'll just pick up one verse, verse 26. Verse 26 of the book of Exodus. And he said, if thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and wilt give ear to his commandments, and keep all these statutes, here's what he'll do. I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. None of these diseases. That world, as you can probably gather from their hygiene, was an infected, unhygienic world. And God says, if you obey my laws, none of these diseases will come upon you. Now, the first reaction you might have is, well, some of those are pretty obvious. They're obvious to us in this century. They were not obvious 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Now, let's take some examples, and I've just chosen a few to give you a perspective. Let's shift gears for a minute and talk about some history, about the plagues of Europe. All of us have done enough reading to be sensitive to the fact that there was a period of time in which Europe was racked with the disease. The greatest disease of them all was leprosy. That may come as a surprise. It was the greatest blight on medieval humanity. It killed countless millions. It even exceeded the Black Plague, the famed Black Plague of the 14th century, or the syphilis plague of the 15th century. Leprosy emerged very dominant during the Middle Ages, the 6th or 7th century, and it reached a terrifying peak in the 13th and 14th centuries. Now, if we talk about plagues in Europe, all of us immediately think of the Black Plague, bubonic plague, because it was, of course, terrifying, and it's also been very vividly immortalized in our literature in all kinds of ways, so most of us are familiar with that. The Black Death, as it's sometimes called, in the 14th century alone, took 1 in 4 persons. Over 60 million people died of the bubonic plague. And that has, of course, given rise to all kinds of references in the literature. That's why we're all so familiar with it. Question: what caused these plagues to get arrested, to stop? They're obviously, they had their day, they became curtailed. How did they become curtailed? Most people don't know that. It turns out that it was the church leadership. We hear so much about ancient church history that's pretty unsavory. Here's one that's very, very constructive. Because they started applying Leviticus chapter 13, verse 46. We might turn, and that's not the only one, but it's representative of the view of the church as they took a look at the scripture. And in Leviticus chapter 13, and we'll just take, it deals with a lot of things. We'll take verse 46. All the days wherein the plague shall be in him shall he be defiled. He is unclean. He shall dwell alone outside the camp shall his habitation be. There are other passages, but this is a crisp one. The Bible, God told Moses that if somebody has plague, specifically he's talking about leprosy, but it applies in general plagues, he is to be isolated from the uninfected. All the church did was start to apply this, and because they had leverage in those days, they enforced a policy that those that were infected were separated. That didn't help the infected ones, but it protected the uninfected, and very quickly the plagues were contained and died out. Interesting how they dealt with this by a policy protecting the uninfected by isolating the infected. It's interesting that the big plagues today, which are more deadly than these, you'll see shortly, our policy is the opposite. We've made the infected the subject of a civil rights policy rather than a medically informed one. We'll come to that. Let's take another example. That's just general hygiene. If you've done any serious reading of medieval Europe, you know that the hygiene was really bad. And through the close of the 18th century, I mean that recently, through that whole period, there was no real sewage, there was no sanitation, it was a mess. As a result, they had cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and lots of other diseases. What's interesting, all of these could have been avoided by just one sentence in the Bible. You might just take a quick look at Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy chapter 23. Verses 12 and 13. Thou shalt have a place also outside the camp where thou shalt go forth abroad, and thou shalt have a shovel among thy weapons, and it shall be when thou shalt ease thyself abroad, thou shalt dig therewith, shalt turn back and cover that which cometh from thee. Polite King James English that tell you exactly what's going on. You and I would call it a privy or what have you. We take this for granted, even for troops in the field and so forth. We don't have these problems. But don't be glib. For a couple of thousand years, they didn't do that. And for a couple of thousand years, life expectancies were short, disease was rampant because of the lack of following these instructions. Now what's interesting, the point I'm trying to make, is there's a interesting contrast we see here. The wisdom of the days of Moses versus the instructions God gave Moses that could have prevented hundreds of millions of deaths throughout those ages if they had been followed. Interesting point. Let's shift gears here and talk about another kind of a problem. Let's talk a little bit for the girls about mortality among expectant mothers. Let's shift. The history of this is rather provocative. We learn a lot of lessons from it. In the 1840s, in Vienna, there was a hospital, Allgemeine Krankenhaus, which is a teaching hospital where they taught doctors. In the maternity ward of that hospital in Vienna in the 1840s, 1 in 6 women died. Now, The reason they died was ascribed to all kinds of thoughts: constipation, delayed lactation, fear, poisonous air, all kinds of contrived excuses. When you examine what was going on then, they had a procedure. Each morning, the medical students would go to the autopsy room to review the people who had died the previous day, to examine them and learn from them. But then they went without washing to inspect the maternity ward, which often involved pelvic examinations and what have you. Now you and I see that in horror, because even the most elemental perspective of hygiene, we recognize right away what's happening. Whatever diseases those bodies were carrying were automatically transmitted to the very vulnerable young women. There was a guy by the name of Ignaz Semmelweis who, after watching this for 3 years, established a procedure for washing. After the autopsy room, the students were to wash thoroughly before going to the maternity ward. In April 1847, 57 women died when he started doing this. In June, 1 in 42 died. In July, only 1 in 84. So it doesn't take any statistical regression analysis to tell you, gee, things are getting better. Not perfect, but they're a lot better, right? What do you think what happened to him? Was he promoted, given a bonus? No. He was fired. That gives you some insight, and you can impugn the medical profession, but I suspect if we look at all professions, they all resist change for the strangest reasons. He eventually got a job in Budapest. The history was the same. He observed the problem, established washing procedures, which the doctors resented. It was an encumbrance. It's all this silly stuff. Same history. The statistics show that the improvements were there, but he also gets fired. In fact, he ultimately dies in a mental institution. Gives us an insight to the cost of innovation and change in an organization. The more emotionally held the views, the more the pain of change. And we even see that in the field of physics today. All kinds of things are overturning the field of physics, of all the hard sciences. It's empirically based. And you watch the physicists are very slow to let go their cherished traditions. But that's another subject. Obviously, you and I can perceive the effects of running water. We won't take the time to look it up, but this is covered in Numbers 19. The idea of washing under running water as a hygiene. Now, it's done several ways. It's done for ritual purity in the Levitical sense, but it's also done for washing, okay? And of course, that's a prelude to our current surgical practices, which I think we've all are aware involves a preoccupation with cleanliness for all the obvious reasons. But again, it's interesting that there's more to this. The Numbers 19 washing thing is an allusion here, but it even goes further. I'd like to talk briefly about cervical cancer. This typically accounts for 25% of the cancers in women. It reaches its peak from between the ages of 31 and 50. And the history of her cervical cancer is really provocative. Early in the 1900s, a Dr. Hiram N. Weinberg at the New York Mount Sinai Hospital noted something very strange in the incidences of cervical cancer. He noticed that it's very rare for a Jewish woman to get cervical cancer. That something could easily escape notice, but he noticed that was true. This was the 1900s. Dr. Ira Kaplan in the New York Bellevue Hospital had the same insight from the records. As late as 1949, now we're suddenly moving to what you and I would consider relatively contemporary periods in a broad sense. At the Mayo Clinic, they noticed that out of 568 consecutive cases of cervical cancer, there wasn't a Jewish woman in the list. In 1954, that's getting recent, in a study of 86,214 women in Boston, cancer of the cervix in non-Jewish women was 8.5 times more frequent than among Jewish women. The American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology notes a low incidence in both Jewish and Indian Muslim women. That's the clue now. Why were these women apparently relatively immune or not subject to cervical cancer? And the answer is circumcision. Turns out circumcision, of course, removes the excess of the foreskin, which facilitates proper cleansing. which includes virulent bacteria, including the cancer-producing smegma bacillus. Deposits of that bacteria in the cervix of the uterus, if the mucous membrane is not intact, like lacerations after childbirth as an example, it can cause irritations, which in turn involve a susceptibility to cancer. Now it's interesting that 4,000 years earlier, that's what God told Moses to do, circumcision. Now he's saying, well, you're saying that's a ritual practice. Yes, but God in instituting it did what? Protected the people that would follow his laws. Interesting. Now, well, again, that's why I get. It's all, and it, obviously, you know the story. In Genesis 17, verses 10 through 12, we have the circumcision. We might want to take a look at that, because there's another aspect of this. We take that so for granted, but let's take a look at Genesis 17. Verse 10 through 12. This is my covenant, which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every male child among you shall be circumcised. Ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every male child in your generations. He that is born in the house or bought with the money of any foreigner who is not of thy seed. Now, obviously, the intent here, the primary purpose, is one of a covenant relationship. Don't let me mislead. But it's interesting that it also provides for the physical health of the people. Now, it's interesting. You notice he says, when is the child, if it's an infant, when is he circumcised? On the 8th day. Let's talk about that for a minute. It turns out that a newborn infant has a peculiar susceptibility to bleeding between, first of all, the 2nd and 5th days of his life. Very susceptible to bleeding. Part of that has to do with vitamin K, a clotting element, which is not formed in the normal amount until the 5th through the 7th day. It picks up. It's at the normal levels from the 7th day on. So the first safe day from a vitamin K point of view is the 8th day. It doesn't end there. There's another necessary ingredient in the blood, prothrombin. On the 3rd day in an infant, it's only 30% of its normal level. It peaks to 110% of normal on the 8th day, and then declines to 100% to its normal level from there on, if it's normal. So if you're going to, knowing what we know about the human body, our present knowledge of physiology, if you were to circumcise a baby on the optimum day, what day would you pick? The 8th day. So the question of the evening is, how did Moses know? Trial and error? You know, I mean, that's... Okay. Now, a study like this is not complete without making at least an allusion to spiritual circumcision, because that term is used in the Old Testament as well as the New, anticipatory of Jesus Christ. The scriptures speak of circumcision of the heart, the carnal heart. And in our notes that accompany these tapes, we'll have a list of those references. There are lots of them in Colossians 2:11, chapter 3, Deuteronomy 10, Jeremiah 4, Romans 2, 4, Galatians 6, and so forth. And in Acts 15, and so forth. So there are plenty of references in the Old and New Testament where circumcision is used spiritually in a whole other sense. But let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about some of these other diseases that the Bible, if you follow admonitions of the Bible, you'd avoid. Let's talk about alcohol. We're not going to get into a big thing here, but let's just hit it lightly. A study which reviewed 27 years of autopsy findings, cause of death analysis, shows that 41.2% of violent deaths involved alcohol. Over 40% of the suicides involved alcohol. Over 20% of the admissions to mental hospitals involves alcohol. And it's been estimated by various different studies that over 50% of the efficiency of our workforce is denied due to alcohol problems. Let's shift gear. That's well known. It's well-traveled ground. We don't have to beat that one here tonight, but just to keep it in front of us. Let's talk about smoking a bit. Lung cancer was hardly known before 1920. That surprised me when I came across that. Then it suddenly went up tenfold, 20-fold, and grew. More men die of lung cancer than any other form of cancer, 1 in 3. That startled me. And it's not just nicotine. There's 8 different chemicals involved, and filtering doesn't help. Your chances of a coronary, statistically, are 70% higher if you smoke, because it reduces the blood flow, it increases cholesterol formation, and it's also associated with eye diseases, emphysema, asthma, ulcers, and on it goes. 1 in 3 who smoke will experience a nicotine death, according to the statistics. Now, we could go on and on like this. I think we've done enough of this. We haven't even talked about drugs, partly because I don't think all the facts are in. It's a very relatively recent phenomenon in our culture, and yet obviously has a major impact. One of the most interesting areas, but we'll reserve this for a separate study, I'll make just a brief allusion to it now, has to do with stress. Your library is full of books talking about the adverse medical effects of stress. What's really interesting is your chemical reaction to fear or challenge is actually opposite. Both of them, you would regard as adrenaline-producing kinds of reactions. If you're suddenly faced with fear, or if you're suddenly faced with a challenge, it turns out the brain chemistry is opposite. Very different. Very different. And you could do a whole study of that aspect played against the admonitions of Jesus Christ. To be anxious for nothing, etc. In other words, stress is a killer. We know that. And that's a whole other thing. But there's another area. We're going to get into some heavier stuff here, particularly in the next session. And before we do, I'd like to clear the air a little bit about some subjects that will lead up to the subject of the next session. And I'd like to start by clarifying vocabulary. And this is maybe just one of my kicks, but I find it disturbing to realize how we're being conned into euphemistic vocabulary where the homosexuals are concerned. The press, it's been fashionable to speak of them as gay. And I'm indebted to Pat Buchanan's syndicated column, which highlighted for me the Family Research Council of Washington, D.C., which cited dozens of experts and studies, including a study of 5,200 obituaries gleaned from over 5 years in 16 homosexual newspapers. It's kind of interesting to take a look at homosexuals. Everybody dies. From the deaths you get records. From the records you can learn a great deal. And here's what they learned. Let's find out how gay these guys really are. The average age of men dying with AIDS is 39. The average age of homosexuals dying of all causes is 41. 41. Only 1% lived to 65 or longer. Only 3% lived over 55. This is gay. The obituaries in the gay press suggest that their lifestyle may cut 2 or 3 decades off one's life expectancy. I don't see that being promoted anywhere, but it's there in the facts. Homosexual men are 3 times as likely to have alcohol or drug abuse problems. In other words, these things are not separable. They tend to get commingled. They're 14 times as likely to have had syphilis. They're 23 times as likely to contract a venereal disease in general. And they're thousands of times more likely to contract AIDS, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I don't want to leave the girls ignored. Lesbians are 19 times more likely than heterosexual women to have had syphilis, twice as likely to suffer from genital warts, 4 times scabies, and on it goes.
For the continuation of this message, please turn this cassette over.
Let's look at geography. San Francisco is the most openly gay city in America. Comparing San Francisco's statistics to the national average, they have twice the rate of infectious hepatitis A, 3 times the rate of infectious hepatitis B, 22 times the national average of venereal disease. Among homosexuals, the ratio of men murdered is 50 times that of the general population. This is gay. They have 60 times the number of suicides. And they have 45 times the number of auto accidents. They're, according to a 1976 study, they're notoriously promiscuous. 43% of them admitted having sex with over 500 partners, 28% over 1,000 partners, most of them anonymous, meaning once. A 1981 study said only 2% are near monogamous, and they define that as less than 10 partners. Heavy-duty stuff. Turn with me, if you will, to Leviticus chapter 18. Let's see what the Torah says, what the Bible says. Leviticus 18, verse 22 reads as follows. Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. Boy, that's straightforward enough, isn't it? In fact, this whole passage elaborates that, but it's interesting even down verse 27. It says, for all these abominations, listing some others too, for all these abominations have the men of the land done who were before you, and the land is defiled. These sins, the homosexuality, was among those forms of perversion that pervaded the land of Canaan, and which of course is the immediate focus here. But in the book of Leviticus, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is abomination. Turn over to chapter 20. Leviticus chapter 20. And let's take a look at verse 13. Many things are listed here, but verse 13, it again is quite explicit. If a man also lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. These are just a couple of passages. Clearly the Bible makes it clear, it is absolutely unequivocal, that homosexuality, homosexual practices are an abomination in the sight of God. And Paul picks this up in the book of Romans, chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. And we'll start about verse 24. Romans chapter 1 should really be read in its entirety, but in the interest of time, we'll pick it up from verse 24. Wherefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. For even their women did exchange the natural use for that which is against nature, and likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, turned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was fitting. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not seemly, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, insolent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who, knowing the judgment of God, that they who commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Sounds like a current editorial, doesn't it? Well, this is all background for the next session. What we're going to deal with in the next session is the discovery that there are now two plagues. All of us can tell, of course, that one of the things we're going to talk about is AIDS. because there's much about AIDS that may come as a real surprise to you. But the real point of next session is that there are two plagues that are both incurable. Both of them involve certain death. Both of them involve genetic defects. Neither of them have any vaccine available, nor will there ever be one. Both of them are subject to deliberate lies and deceit on the part of the government, the schools, and the media. In fact, there's even aggressive recruitment involved with both of them. And so for that's what we'll take up next time. So I'll see you then.
If you have enjoyed this message and would like further information regarding other materials, please ask your local bookstore or write us at Koinonia House, Post Office Box D, Coeur d'Alene, or CDA, Idaho, 838-16-0347. Or you can give us a call at area code 208-773-8524.